Hi, welcome to the Move Smartly Show. I'm your host, Urmi Desai, editor here at Move Smartly. Thank you for joining us today. If you find our show useful, please subscribe to us and give us a positive review on whatever platform you're watching or listening to us from. Today's episode is a return to our semi-regular feature called Move Smartly Ideas, where my co-host John Pasalis and I unpack and discuss some of the bigger issues impacting the housing market in Toronto and Canada. I always enjoy drawing on John's knowledge and expertise, which stems both from his work as a real estate broker and president of Velocity Realty Brokerage here in Toronto, and his research and analytical work, which is cited by the Bank of Canada, the IMF, and others, work that he continues to build on as a doctoral candidate at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto and the University of Reading in the UK. So, with all that, John, are you ready?
Ready to go. What are we talking about today?
To set up today's chat, I wanted to share some of my background thinking about why I chose today's particular topic, which is how should we be measuring housing needs and results? When I joined John in launching Velocity and Move Smartly back in 2010 and moved into the housing sector content and communications field full time, I found myself anchoring around key numbers, you can say. For example, one number you will hear often in housing is the affordability rule, that no more than 30% of your pre-tax income or 40% of your after-tax or disposable income should go to your housing costs. Since then, the Ontario household is now calculated to be spending around 60% in disposable income on housing costs. Hold that thought. Here's another number that I remember, home price appreciation. Back then, John was noting that the Toronto area was starting to climb above the 6% average we'd seen for years, the year-over-year appreciation average of 6%. And John was already noting that that was high. In the years since, we've seen year-over-year appreciation go even higher than this. It's been 11% on average since 2015. Hold that thought. Recently, it seems that a big new number has emerged, yet another new number, which is the number of homes we'd need to build to see housing become affordable again. These numbers are a bit less clear. One study suggests that the number for Ontario is 1.5 million homes a year, and another is 2.5 million homes a year. So, in doing this chat with you today, John, I guess I have two big things on my mind. The first is why that when it comes to housing policy, we don't seem to track and hold to housing numbers the way we do, for example, inflation. Most of us are familiar with the 2% benchmark for inflation, and we routinely refer to these numbers. And by we, I mean most of all our elected officials and the media that reports on them. In comparison, how many of us know right now that Ontario is on average 10% higher than it should be on the housing affordability figure, and that the Toronto area is likely, like for sure, actually, much higher than that? Just what is this exact number this current year, and where are the press conferences and plans around bringing that number back down to 40%? The second thought I have is how certain we are around these big housing numbers. Is there a lot of housing economics consensus around these numbers, or are there a lot of unknowns? So I'm hoping to unpack that through our chat today.
Sounds good.
All right. So the first one, housing affordability. John, let's start with the definition of housing affordability and how it's defined and why. So I've just spoken about the 30% pre-tax rule or 40% disposable rule. Does that apply to homeowners and renters, and is it still current?
Yeah, I'd say it is still current. It's like a long-standing, I guess, rule of thumb, I'd say, rather than some, scientific formula that someone came to. Rule of thumb used in the housing industry, rule of thumb probably used by financial planners, that kind of look at people's spending and incomes and say, okay, what is a reasonable amount to be spending on housing? So yeah, generally the ratios are about 30% of your pre-tax income or 40% of your disposable income, your after-tax income. Now you do raise a good question. I mean, this ratio generally is used both for rental housing and owner-occupied housing. Which is a little bit problematic because, it makes sense, I would say, for rental housing because, I mean, all of that is an out-of-pocket expense, right? Whereas for owner-occupied housing, part of a household's housing payment is actually forced savings, because part of that goes towards their principal repayment. And quite frankly, even CMHC says that, home's affordable if you're not spending more than 30% of your before tax income on housing. But when they finance mortgages, they're willing for that to go up to 39% of your before tax income. So, this is, of course, slightly problematic because you have sort of these competing definitions. On the one hand, they're saying homeowners should not be spending more than 30% of their before tax income. On the other hand, they're giving up mortgages based on 39%. And I mean, I tend to agree that it should probably be a little bit higher for home owning households rather than renters, because again, like we said, part of that payment is not just pure expense. Part of that is, of course, forced savings. So we would expect it to be a little bit higher. And I would think that, CMHC should be factoring some of those differences in as well.
Indeed, the CMHC itself says, which I found a little bit interesting in reading the report, that the 30% figure, they couldn't find a lot of background on it. It says here that this figure seemed to have arisen during political discussions in the United States in the 70s.
Interesting.
They go on to use that 30% pre-tax number
Yeah.
to continue with their affordability investigation. But
Yeah.
I think that points to perhaps how much there is still kind of not known around some of these big numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And they use the 30%, I believe, in the housing supply report for, again, owner occupied housing as well.
They do.
Rather than just rental housing. So that is interesting because, again, like I said, they're underwriting based on 39%. But they're saying affordability should be 30%, which is, how much of this is just like a nice to have rather than what is actually affordable, right?
Yes, very interesting. So the second question is the CMHC, that same report states, and that report, by the way, is a 2022 report, which will be in all our show notes. If the average household were to buy the average house on sale in 2021, they would be devoting 60% of their disposable income. So remember, the target is 40% to housing costs in Ontario and British Columbia. So John, my question is, how is this even possible? How do people get mortgages if they can't afford them? If the affordability limit is 40%, how are they getting it at 60%?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it seems like it should be impossible. I mean, they are not giving out mortgages in situations where a household's, budget is 60% going towards housing. Our banking regulator is not underwriting mortgages that way. So you're right. It is an important question. How the heck are people able to afford this? And let's keep in mind that this does factor into account, mortgage costs and interest rates, right? So when they do these calculations of what is the typical mortgage payment on a home based on a median price, median household income, and that's how they come up with these measures, which I'm going to digress for a moment to say that, in many ways, this is a little bit of a better measure than, we hear about sort of these ratios like home prices to household income, and they've been increasing over time. And, that is, again, another metric we often hear about. When I got into the industry, 15 years ago, I think the average home price was like 5 times the average household income or median household income in the Toronto area. Now it's about 10 times, right? One thing that these things don't obviously price to income factor in is the change in interest rates, which plummeted during COVID, which kind of drove home prices higher. Now we're obviously significantly higher. So today's level cannot be explained by interest rates, but that's a separate issue. Now, going back to the 60%, how is that even possible? And the main answer is that when it comes to owner occupied housing, people are getting around this and still able to afford largely because they are making bigger down payments on homes, right? This is kind of how you get around these numbers. So it's not that the average household or the median household is spending 60% of their disposable income. This ratio assumes they have a certain down payment and have a median income at a median price. But the reality is more and more households are getting money from families. Statistics Canada actually just last week or this weekend, remember, they just published a report and they basically showed that, one of the big factors that differentiates whether someone's going to own a home or not are the number of homes their parents own, you know, and even just owning their principal residence has a significant impact on someone's ability to afford a home, all else equal, taking into account age, income, province, all of that stuff. You know, having parents who own homes has a big impact. Of course, the more real estate they own has a bigger impact. So what's happening is people are just coming to the housing market with more cash, and not all of it is savings. Some of it is just, you know, gifts from family in many cases, like this report highlights, because that's the way people are able to get into the housing market. So that's how we can have a market where, you know, in theory or on paper, 60% of a household's income is going towards mortgage payments. That's not actually happening, but it is the number if you just took into account a median, you know, home price and a median income. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And John, so you're pointing out what the income to housing cost ratio doesn't take into account is that extra cash. Now, not all of it is cash on hand, though. How many parents are using HELOCs or other types of loans to tap into the equity of the homes that have run up in prices during this unprecedented boom?
Yes. I mean, so listen, we see it even in our office. In some cases, parents are borrowing from existing real estate, and, you know, basically, you know, giving the money. So it's borrowing, HELOCs, whatever it is. And it's basically like an advance on the kids, you know, inheritance, if you want to think about it like that. You know what I mean?
Of that home, like,
Of
you know,
that home
eventually.
or of those
Right,
properties or whatever the
right,
family has, right?
right.
It's almost like a cash advance on that. I guess their thinking is, why are we going to wait till, you know, we are in our 80s and our kids 60 or 55 for them to get this this inheritance? Why not give them a little bit today so they can get started? So some of that is borrowed, some of that is cash. I mean, we've had clients who you know, are obviously well off, who have great careers, who've saved their money, who are just buying homes for their kids in cash, right?
Right.
And again, like, this is another way that these ratios kind of don't make sense. Like, it doesn't take that into account. Like, you know, when you have a parent buying a home in cash, your personal income as the person that's occupying that home is irrelevant at that point. Like, you could be making $100,000 a year and have a $1.5 million home. You know, that obviously doesn't make sense. But if you have someone buying the home for you, that's, you know, and this is partly going back to your original question, how we get to this point where the numbers just seem so odd and they seem like they're defying gravity.
And just a quick question before we move on from this. How advanced, I'm guessing not very, are attempts by research bodies, academics, to try and quantify what that cash number may look like? I know StatsCan came out with the likelihood that you would be a homeowner if your parents were.
Yeah, there's
How
not
robust are, you know, the attempts to quantify the magnitude of that extra financing coming into the market?
That's a great question. I can't I don't think the Statistics Canada report that I'm talking about that came out had averages or actual numbers. Like, they did cite a report from CIBC that came out maybe, I don't know, a year or two ago, that did try to measure that. And, you know, I can't remember what their methodology was. And it was, I think, written by Benjamin Tal, who's an economist at CIBC. But they did show that this number is increasing. And I believe what they found was, like, you know, in recent years, like, this number has exceeded six figures from what I remember. I mean, it's just off the top of my head. Whereas, you know, 10 plus years ago, you know, is in the tens of thousands. And that's is consistent with my own experience from when I got into this business. Like I said, almost 15 years ago, gifts from family were like $20,000-$30,000, you know, and gifts from family today are, you know, still, you might get some that are 20, 30, but many of them are six figures, right? And listen, you have to keep in mind that many families in that 15-year period have probably seen their existing home appreciate much more than the $100,000 they're going to give their kids, right? So this is partly what is facilitating that. It's actually like, I mean, this is the insane part. It's like the rapidly rising home prices that are making it harder to get in is what is allowing the boomer generation to cut bigger checks to give to their kids, right? Which again is really only making it harder for non-homeowning people whose parents don't own housing to actually get into the market. So it is actually kind of widening the wealth inequality that we're seeing.
Right. So that gap, the financing gap's increasing. All right. So we've talked, and we're talking right now about home ownership largely, and that CMHC study that we are quoting from 2022 does too. What does the affordability situation look like for renters right now? So I assume that 30% pre-tax income rule still
Yeah,
holds for renters, but
it does.
what is that
And
on the ground?
that's a great question. And I think this is where, so when we're looking at the statistics for households, I mean, we can see that the number, in Ontario, you said close to 60% of disposable income, if you have the median income, median home prices going towards mortgage payments. So we can see these numbers sort of deviate from what they should be based on capital injections into the housing market from parents. So that's how you can get to that point. You can't really see that as much on rental housing, because with rental housing, your housing costs are constrained by income, right? So it should not deviate significantly from that. So we're not going to see sort of these rental affordability issues by saying, well, how much is the average tenant paying on housing? Well, that's never going to deviate from what it should be, as the way it would for homeowning households, right? So what we're seeing, of course, is just skyrocketing rents. And, on the ground, we're seeing, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like if we look at, I'll give you just an example I tweeted out actually last week or 2 weeks ago. So one of I think the first apartment I rented out of undergrad, I think it was in 2000, was at a building at 100 Gloucester, which is kind of downtown Toronto. I mean, and to put it like, it's a bit of a dumpy building, it was not a great building. I was like one of these thrifty kids. I did not want anything fancy. I'm like, I wanted the cheapest studio apartment I can find. I want to save my money. I don't need anything flashy. So back then, it was basically $600 a month for rent, right? And if we do a very simple, again, affordability, where I say a third of your before tax income should go to housing, you basically needed an income of $22,000 to afford that unit. Okay, that's it. Now fast forward to 2023, that same studio apartment, I mean, no bedrooms, it's like 450 square feet. There's no ensuite laundry. You got to go to the main floor, the basement, to the shared laundromat. It's an old building. That unit today, I saw it advertised for $2,173, so $2,200 a month. What do you need? What kind of an income do you need to support that today? $78,000, which is insane. If you think about like the growth in like like incomes have not gone up 3.5 times since 2020, right? And these buildings that should, in theory, this is an old purpose-built rental that is not fancy, it's not a condo, these in theory should be the affordable units in Toronto, and they're not affordable, right? They're not affordable for anyone with a, $78,000 a year is a pretty good salary for one person. That is not, modest income. So even these units are not affordable. And this is, we talk about this on the show. I talk about this on Twitter. It is renters who are getting crushed. We call this an affordability crisis. Anyone who owns housing, there's no freaking crisis. You're doing okay. You've made money. You're probably going to keep making money after the interest rates recover, but you've done well. Even if prices dip 10%, I mean, you've done well if you owned your home for quite a while. The crisis is really predominantly in rental housing, right? And again, when you think about these small little studio apartments renting for $2,200 a month, that's not affordable. So this is kind of where we see on the ground. There's just so few options. And when you look at how many houses are available for people on, just modest, minimum wage or modest incomes, there's not many options out for people. And this is kind of where we're seeing the biggest crisis in rental housing.
Yeah, and that chimes a bit to my moves. That I was a little delayed in getting my first job because I did postgraduate studies. I lived in a very modest building in Ottawa. It was so old. The one good thing is older buildings were all concrete walls, it seems. So
Hmm.
that thing was like a soundproof bunker, but
Hmm.
it was very, very modest. I didn't really have great furniture too. I remember on a couple like later than I should have overturning cardboard boxes,
Yeah.
kind of putting, cloth on them and getting by. Why was I doing it? I presume the same reason you were, was to save that cash
Hmm.
for longer term moves, i.e., getting into
Exactly.
the real estate market. The accusations now we hear a little bit about the avocado toast generation, I feel are
Oh
really
gosh.
unfair. I mean,
Yeah.
how much can you save
It's
when
impossible. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
impossible? It's like your income's actually going to what you would pay for a mortgage.
Yeah.
Like it's not, there's no savings.
I mean,
Even
and the
though you're in a less modest building, you're not
yeah.
even getting.
And I mean, I'll confess, I don't look at purpose-built rental rents very often. Like, it's just not our space. Like, when we look at rental housing, we're looking at condos, we're looking at houses. That's just what we deal with as a brokerage. So, I mean, I got floored, and I actually saw this because I saw someone who's looking for an apartment downtown and asked me for advice. And I said, this is where you need to look. These dumpy purpose-built rentals. This is what's got to be cheaper. And then they texted it to me, and I got floored because like $2,200 a month is not that. It's basically what you're paying to rent a condo studio, and that's what really shocked me. In a condo, it's newer, it has ensuite laundry, it has amenities. Like, there are reasons why some people might pay 2,200 in a condo, but you would expect an old purpose-built rental to be significantly lower than that, and it wasn't. And I was just floored by what they were charging.
And that leads us to the next observation. And this is probably why supply has become the buzzword. So,
Mhm.
the answer to why old purpose built rentals are no longer providing the affordable housing they should, because there's not enough of them.
Mhm.
The reason why houses are appreciating too much out of a family's reach, because there's
Mhm.
not enough detached homes. So the
Yeah.
answer to everything is there's not enough. There's not enough. And
Yeah.
so the response to the housing affordability crisis has been this new generation of big numbers. And that
Mhm.
is, how many houses do we need for things to become affordable again?
Mhm.
So, we've got, I feel like every other organization or individual researchers focusing on it, from the Federal Crown Corporation, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation,
Mhm.
CMHC, is trying to figure out these numbers. Housing Task Force, that was founded by the Ford Ontario government, they're spitting out numbers, and the media has been covering every single report. It feels
Mhm.
like that's been coming out about what that number might be. Why do
Mhm.
you think the discussion really started focusing on this supply number, rather than, for example, measuring the demand that might be generated by, as you were mentioning before, people being able to tap into the bank of mom and dad?
Mhm.
That is in a way excess demand, if you think about it, when you have
Yeah.
uh, other kinds of sources of income. Why this sort of trend to look at the supply side and try to measure it, rather than trying to quantify some of those demand side factors that are driving up price?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it is quite odd. I mean, our government, and even a lot of economists are almost like they're acting like the demand for housing is out of our control. It's something that is external to the government. We can't do anything about it, but the only thing we can do is try to fix housing with more supply, right? Which is actually like the exact opposite of the real world, quite frankly. I mean, government has way more levers over the demand for housing. In particular, when it comes to Canada's population growth through immigration, through non-permanent residents, right? They sign a visa for everybody. So, they control the demand for housing. What you cannot control very easily as a government is the supply of housing. There are a lot of frictions on the supply. Um, not just zoning, which is, what sort of the YIMBY movement likes to argue, but, there are labor constraints in Canada. You need infrastructure dollars to build more housing. So I think economists, I think it's been focused largely on supply for a few reasons. I mean, partly because this is the narrative that our government wants to sell. You know what I mean? That, you know, and what they're trying to sell is like there's no, the demand that they're basically allowing in Canada is sort of this irrelevant metric. Who's really to blame are the mayors and the NIMBYs and the builders who just aren't building enough homes, right? And I think it is a political message that, some economists have decided to side with. But really, I mean, I think it's actually making our crisis worse because, I mean, you shouldn't need a PhD to know that when Canada's growing by over 1 million people per year and we're only building 200,000 homes, this is a decision to, inflate the demand for housing, to push more people into homelessness, quite frankly, and to drive up rents on lower income households. Like, this is a decision, and it is an odd approach because Canada is a country that apparently had decided years ago that housing should be a human right. But when you make a decision as a country to have like 1 million people moving here per year and only 200,000 homes, you've also have made the decision not to make housing a human right because we know that's not adequate housing. So I think it's largely political, and the government has some economists who are jumping on this bandwagon, pretending that there's no limit to how many homes we can build if we just reform certain policies. And there are economists who do that. I mean, there was like a bunch who came out with a report, I think it was called the National Housing Accord, who actually just tried to argue and our entire rental crisis can be solved with supply side interventions, that almost like the demand is irrelevant. I actually think they had the word demand only once in the entire report. So it's a bit of an odd, I think, approach, but I guess some economists are kind of backing our government's narrative.
So I'm going to suggest a few other reasons why I felt maybe that is the case. So a lot of economic researchers are housed in think tanks that are associated with universities.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these universities are themselves involved in the immigration boom, the biggest increase in foreign students we've seen, largely because Ontario universities need this incoming of students for their bottom line. And let's take the less nefarious angle. Canada's other narrative, which is longstanding, one I certainly agree with, is a multinational and immigrant-friendly country. And that is a hard thing to want to put a lot of papers out against, that we have too many immigrants. I suggest that even researchers shy away from that. So like, aside, the government will have its one narrative, but I wonder if part of that issue is that we did see recently, however, a lot of banks, and all of a sudden there was a bit of a sea change where people were able to finally say, top institutions, is the level of immigration too fast, too furious right now? And in response, we've seen a bit of tinkering. I suggest there's one other reason, which is even more dangerous than the immigration word: taxation. Because on the demand side, a lot more could be done if we understood the amount of which investment is taking place to drive up, right? That infusion of extra cash. Where is that cash coming from? And if that instrument of taxation was used. But again, is that a very, what government wants to go in and say, oh, we just have to go around taxing every third and fourth house, right? That an individual owns. So that makes sense to me, why the supply story is so attractive to politicians. I kind of even get why a lot of universities would be interested in it, and university researchers and academics. Why the media doesn't crack down a bit on it, I'm not sure. But even if I take all of that for what it is, the supply numbers themselves are confusing. So let's look at two of the biggest, sources we see. So we have the federal agency, CMHC, that I mentioned. Their latest report suggests that Ontario needs 2.5 million homes a year to reach affordability, again, by those numbers we talked about earlier, by 2030. The Ford-appointed Ontario Housing Task Force says 1.5 million homes a year are needed to be affordable by then. That's a million home difference. So for those that are trying to define it, why are there such inconsistent numbers?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to backtrack and touch on your last point because I think you made a couple good points. And certainly, one I did not touch on, the reason why people focus on supply and don't talk about demand. You're 100% right. Up until a little while ago, it was politically controversial to ask if a certain level of population growth is too high, right? You had some people arguing that even asking this question is xenophobic. I mean, which I mean, obviously, I think is obviously a ridiculous question, because most people who are asking these questions are not like anti-immigration. I mean, but to the people who throw those words out, in their view, even the level of growth under previous liberal governments is xenophobic in their view, because it's less than what this current government's doing. So even sort of asking if we should kind of have a level that was more sustainable. So it is very odd. I think that has changed a little bit. That tone has changed a little bit, partly because people are getting killed in affordability. So people are starting to ask the demand question, and some economists are,
including the new immigrants themselves.
100%. Yes.
Happened when it was these new immigrants who are trying to rent and who are at the brunt of it, sleeping on the streets, or going back to war-torn countries because they can't, it's actually not safer here.
Exactly, especially in rental housing. I mean, it is just some of them are living in deplorable conditions, right? Mm-hmm. So, when we are concerned that we're not building enough homes for the hundreds of thousands of students coming in, it's not xenophobic. To me, it's like it's so problematic to invite people here when you don't have a home for them. You know what I mean?
Yes, but anyways, do you not find, John, that because you do have a foot in the research world, that's got to be to put a chill on the questions you want to ask, because it is difficult. You're putting towards a proposal on what you want to research. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard to believe that when you're not proposing these questions to a committee or getting, support for a report, or, I'm going to look into this big number. I do suspect whether that has been part of the problem, especially in the education sector, which is not only involved in this activity, but in itself has a real sort of desire not, to be anti-prejudicial at all costs. I do wonder if we look at the pure question of research and numbers, whether that's played a part in it.
Huge. And you mentioned another thing, I think, earlier about think tanks, right? The fact is, many of these think tanks who are putting out these supply can solve our entire housing crisis type reports are largely funded by builders.
Yes.
By like the Ontario Builders Association. Yes. Really. And, so the research is really just promoting the builders' narrative, right?
And they're not often wrong in identifying obstacles to building.
Yes.
And I'm not opposed to that. What I'm trying to get at is this big number that's going to solve everything. Like that, it's the wrapping around it that's the issue. If you just released a report saying, hey, these are the top 5 problems builders are facing, mm-hmm. and we need more homes, but that's not it. This is the silver bullet. We're being prevented from delivering the silver bullet. And I noticed that's been the real change to my mind.
Yes. And they're actually pretending that the impossible is possible. Like anyone who pretends that Canada or Ontario can solve our housing crisis by tripling the number of homes we build or doubling is not being intellectually honest, because we all know that that's not impossible. And
let's get to that, because I think we'll even start to see that in these reports themselves.
Yes.
Before we do, let's get back to the comment you were about to make around why these numbers are so different in the first place. So how can you be $1 million off? Is that reasonable? Yes. Is that just the way the research goes, or what are your thoughts on that?
100%. So CMHC basically came out with the housing supply report, said we need, I can't even remember, it's like Canada needs like 5.8 million homes in like the next 7-8 years. I mean, we only build 200,000 homes a year, so this is like a ridiculous target. And I think what that translated to is about 2.5 million. Ontario needed to build 2.5 million homes by 2030, right? Ontario's government's housing affordability task force came out with a measure saying, well, we need to build 1.5 million homes. Now, why is there such a big difference? I mean, you know, it's a difficult question. I mean, let's start off by saying, number one, like the provincial government didn't really outline how they got to the 1.5 million. It's just like they pulled a number out of the air. Maybe there was some science to it, but they didn't disclose their methodology or why they came to that or how they came to that. So certainly, one constraint or limitation to each organization's research is, well, what do they define as being affordable, right? And I think certainly CMHC's is kind of a bit optimistic. Basically, I think it's like they want housing to be as affordable as it was 20 years ago. And like 20, I can't remember what the year was, but it was roughly 20 years ago. It's like, to get back to that level, we need to build this many homes, right? So how we define our end goal of affordability is obviously going to be a function of how many homes we need to get to that point. So the CMHCs might be, a little bit aggressive. But the other thing to keep in mind is, even if we have, or two people have the exact same measure of affordability, measuring the number of homes a country or a province needs is a very hard thing to do. I mean, there are two parts to that. One is thinking about our housing shortfall today, right? Like, how many homes are we short even in today's environments, which is hard to do. And then how many do we need to support our growth in the future, right? So why is it hard to do? I mean, it's hard to do. It's hard to measure our shortfall and even our future growth, because, one mistake people do, and I've seen, like, for sure, real estate agents and some academics do this, where they say, well, look at the number of homes we've built. It roughly lines up with the number of new households that have formed. Therefore, we are on track, right? And that logic is problematic, because you can't measure housing that way. At the end of the day, the number of homes that are available to be occupied is a constraint on the number of households that are forming. I mean, if a kid's living in his parents' basement and wants to move out but has nowhere to move to, he cannot form a new household on his own if it's too expensive to do that, right? So, when we think about how many houses we need, how many like homes we need, there are a lot of factors. I mean, certainly the population and sheer number of people in a country is one thing. The age of the population, the demographic, is another thing. And the number of households we currently have, and the age and demographic matters, because, again, and this is why it's so tricky. You can't just use population, because just imagine just this theoretical world where Canada's, immigration and non-permanent resident numbers went to zero next year, right? But everyone went on a baby boom and, had 300,000 kids, next year. So our population has gone up by 300,000 people, right? But we don't need homes for everyone, because all of those babies have homes. Now, it doesn't mean our existing housing stock is adequate, right? It just means we don't have necessarily a shortage of housing, right? Now, the types of homes we have may not fit the needs of existing homeowners, which means we might need to start to build slightly larger homes for some people, but we don't necessarily need, tens of thousands of new housing units to meet that demand, right? Whereas if you flip it around and say, nobody has kids next year, but our population grows by 300,000 purely by new immigrants with families, well, then you're going to say, well, we need at least 30,000 new homes for those people, right? So, this is why it's not so easy to measure these things, because, like household formation, like I said, is constrained by the number of homes we have. And what happens is you have like one of the side effects of a supply constrained market, or a market where demand exceeding supply, is suppressed household formation, which means people are not building their own homes. They're staying in their parents' homes longer. They're living with friends in apartments longer. They're not kind of branching out into their own housing. And then the other side effect is like forced migration, people just leaving the country. And we're starting to see that, right? Like we see that in Ontario, forced migration to other provinces, right? And we hear that people moving to Eastern Canada, people moving to Alberta. This is a side effect of constrained housing supply, right? That's pushing people out. So it is tricky to measure, but I mean, certainly, I am in the camp that we're certainly ridiculously undersupplied. And you can kind of see this in skyrocketing rents. You know, there are side effects of a constrained housing market. Home prices can skyrocket even if you're not supply constrained, because there's speculation, there's low interest rates, all these things. But rent does not skyrocket in a normal market if the housing supply is not constrained relative to the demand. So that's a long answer, but hopefully I answered it.
Actually, you've hit on the head what I found dismaying about the CMHC's homepage recently. And for the record, I know so many brilliant people that have worked as a CMHC and had a lot of the other organizations that we interview regularly on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a former civil servant, and I hold to the fact that you will not meet better minds than you will
Mm-hmm.
see in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Canada and Ontario's top civil service institutions. Having said all that, I think you just explained why seeing this top slogan, "We are driven by one goal, where all Canadians have a place to call home," as if that's a mission statement that means anything, really bothered me. And it filled me with dismay, I think, for the reason you just articulated. That if you can't articulate the problem properly, that many Canadians have a place to call home, someone's basement, someone's couch, two families that are refugees from a foreign conflict living together, buying a house together, students all rammed together somewhere in a suburb of Toronto, Brampton, as they eke out their degrees. Fine, they have a place to call home. What does that mean? And I think you've helped me understand a little bit that the research around trying to quantify what that really would mean is probably not as robust as we think it is in terms of being able to project, what would really be necessary for people to have the kind of homes in which I guess they would say I would thrive in, or if not thrive in, at least be able to get to the next stage of my life from.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing from you is that's really hard to figure out. So in the meantime, it's going to be a lot easier to say we need X number of homes. So that's understandable. I can't blame organizations for doing that. So let's return to the CMHC's report where they do try to do that. I have another observation. So if I just zoom in on the Ontario numbers. So CMHC, by the way, you said earlier, you're not entirely sure their methodology. I do believe they tried to use that 30% housing cost as part of pre-tax income number, which in its own report, as I mentioned, they mentioned there's not actually a lot of background research on this. It seems to be a figure that, again, came up in the United States in the 70s. In any case, they use it. It's a well-known figure. They use that figure then to see the last time when, that was roughly true for most of Canada. The irony being, John, that, we always say real estate's local, 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 and that sounds like your local agent, the shark down the street slogan. But in real estate, it happens to be true. CMHC points out that effortlessly, most Canadian provinces would hit that number. In fact, the outliers when it comes to affordability are Ontario and Quebec. Ontario and BC. It points out that BC has long been above this trend of affordability, so it's been unaffordable for a very long time. Ontario has sort of rocketed out of that zone faster, maybe around the mid 2010 decade. And Quebec, they're only worried about because it's starting to move out of its normal zone for housing affordability. So I found that very interesting. I invite you to look at the report. It's a very regional situation. In fact, they say the crisis, if we're honest about the shortage of supply, is in Ontario and BC.
Mhm.
And then we look at at Ontario. If they were to hold affordability to that 30% mark or around it,
Mhm.
so 37, so that would be 40 post-tax. So they're saying about 37 or 40.
Mhm.
I was struck by the projection of what house prices would have to be. So the price of a home in their report in 2021 on average in Ontario is 871,000. To move to that affordability target, it would have to be around $500,000. Now,
500,000. Okay.
yeah. So
In Ontario.
871 in Ontario.
Okay.
So, and we're talking a span of 9 years. Now,
Mhm.
would that drop in prices, which I'll leave you to do the math. I think that's around, is that a
Over 40. I mean, it's
37%
massive.
decrease?
No, it's more than that. It's more than that. Yeah.
In home prices, wouldn't that constitute a housing collapse if that was to take place over 8 years? And also, we're already seeing builders not wanting to build in this high interest rate environment. Would they really want to build all this additional supply in the face of what I would think would be seen as collapsing home prices?
Yeah. I mean, it seems, I mean, I think this is part of the, I don't know how to put it politely, like the insanity behind our government's claims, CMHC's claims, and the economists who kind of advocate this solution. Like in their world, builders are just going to want to rapidly keep building homes in an environment where home prices have crashed 40%. Okay, because that's what you need to do. If you're going from 870 to 500, now let us ignore the fact that this would likely lead to massive potential financial stability concerns, because most people or a lot of households do not have that much equity in their home. So there's going to be a lot of households underwater, which means that their mortgage is worth more than what their home's worth, which obviously presents risks for both CMHC and for the banks if they have to default on their mortgage. But let's leave the financial risks, economic risks when home values are declining aside. The reality is, builders in an environment of falling home prices are not flooding the market with more supply. This happens. This is like magical thinking in the world of YIMBY economists who think that, you know, builders are benevolent. They're not businesses, they're just benevolent people who wants to fill the housing market with more housing, and the only thing preventing them are municipal zoning restrictions. So this is never going to happen. I mean, it's never going to happen. So this is, I don't understand the economists who pretend that this will happen and this is a realistic solution. This is basically what our federal governments and even our provincial governments are promising, and it is not rooted in any reality, I'd say.
Yes, and as dismaying as the Canadian federal government of Justin Trudeau has been on this file, I did note that Pierre Poilievre had a similar statement when
Yeah.
he said that he expected the fall economic statement to be about, you know, more accountability for what municipalities are accomplishing the housing starts that would be necessary
Mhm.
to build us out of this housing affordability crisis. So
Yeah.
we really don't see that many actors on any side, whether
No.
it's Ontario government pushing back against the feds. No, they seem to be saying the same thing. At the Ontario, at the federal level of political competition, we don't see a lot of difference. So the real narrative around the supply side has taken hold.
The supply, and I think we can kind of see sort of the supply theory by looking at what the BC government has done. BC is basically upzoned most of their areas and municipalities around transit. So they very recently came out with these announcements where the BC government's going to override municipal planning, allow higher density housing buildings, higher density, like just basically upzone everything to allow for more housing around transit oriented areas. Very good idea. I mean, I think this is good socially. I think it's good environmentally. We definitely want more housing. All the housing advocates were, of course, very supportive. But when you actually look at the numbers, how much do the provincial government think they might see in terms of new housing in these areas? And their estimate, which is very rough, and they say it may not happen, but if everything lines up, maybe they'll see housing completions pick up 10,000 per year. Okay. Now, 10,000 per year might sound like a lot, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, BC builds about 30,000+ homes per year, right? This 10,000 is likely not going to be just new completions. I mean, there is going to be some substitution where some builders decide, okay, I'm not going to build here. I'm going to build in this new dense transit area. But even if that wasn't the case, even if these were net new completions, this is really just a 30% increase in housing supply. Even if we assumed everything is perfect and they can't hit that target and they're new and they're not substituting the existing supply, they're going from building 30-ish thousand homes a year to 40-ish. That is a it's a huge gap from what our governments say we need to do, which is more than double and triple housing completions. So, this tells you that this is never going to happen. Even when governments do everything they should, you cannot overwhelm the housing market with supply because there are a lot of constraints on it. And even the best zoning reforms are not going to result in a tripling of housing completions anytime soon.
Yes. And my own thinking is like, I don't want to sour grapes it. I think we are seeing the type of development, pushes that are just great for building really robust communities.
Yeah, they are good.
The research supports that. Like we've seen that now. Better outcomes for individuals, for loneliness, for fitness levels. There's just so many benefits. And I am jealous of BC's housing minister because I think he is doing a heck of a job in the last few weeks that I wish Ontario's minister could be doing on communicating these files. So,
sure.
I would agree with that. These policies are amazing, but where I'm really dismayed is this linking then back to some kind of research-backed, and this will solve the housing affordability crisis. And I think that's sad that you can't promote these projects for being important on their own, which I don't know if you can. Maybe there's a communication issue with mainstream Canadian citizens and us. And that, we need to be convinced that it's going to solve something for our pocketbooks. I'm not sure. Or if there's just genuine confusion. And so maybe that leads me to our last question today, which is that even if we think these supply targets are suspect, maybe we can't reach them. That leaves the other side, that the governments have announced these kind of targets and that it is now some civil servant's poor job to track the targets. Being a formal civil servant, I know that this involves a lot less sophistication than you would think. We're talking spreadsheets, phoning up municipalities, trying to get a sense of what's going on. Not everything is publicly available. You can't just Google, hey, how many starts are there? Markham, how many starts are there? Housing starts. So even leaving aside the trouble of tracking, let's talk about whether governments are tracking the right things. So we've seen recent headlines that the Ford government is really wanting to look at what municipalities have achieved certain housing starts. I'm wondering if you can unpack for us what housing starts are so we can understand that and whether that is the right way to then track whether this supply, even if it's not going to be as great as we think it will be, as we've been saying, whether starts are even the right way to measure what will actually be on the ground in terms of dwellings we can live in. Because along the way, we're hearing about, canceled projects and developers that pull out of things. So fine, you start, but does that really mean a home that someone can live in at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually was in the news recently because the provincial government in Ontario had kind of set aside some money as an incentive for municipalities to encourage more housing. And like you said, I mean, this is how ridiculous governments are. For I don't know how many months, they didn't really articulate how they were measuring these targets. And specifically, nobody knew if they were measured based on approvals by the cities or housing starts or housing completions. Nobody knew. And then the provincial government clarified and said, well, we're actually going to do it based on housing starts, right? And a housing start is basically exactly what it sounds like. Construction has started. I think in For condos, like I think it needs to be above ground or something like that. Like I don't think it's just starting the parking counts. I think it needs to be a certain amount above grade. But at the end of the day, construction has started on building housing units. And the municipality said, well, wait a second, that's not fair, because the municipalities cannot control when builders start homes, right? They can only control their approvals. And some of them had said, well, listen, we met our targets on approvals. We approved X number of homes, but builders just aren't building them. So who's to blame for that? And it is, I mean, it's a valid question. I mean, the province, if they're setting these targets, should be based on permits approved. I mean, of course, not every building permit results in a home built, right? Some projects might fail. They might not be able to get canceled. They might not be able to get financing. When they actually go and kind of go through the process, the numbers don't work anymore. So of course, not every permit issued is going to be resulting in a housing start or a housing completion. But yeah, there are ways to measure, and certainly permits issued is the one, housing starts is another. And we can measure these things even before, like way before the homes are done. You know, like Ontario upzoned pretty much every single family home in Ontario. So any home that was like a detached home, they basically said, okay, you convert that to a triplex now, pretty much across the board. So, you know, many housing advocates had said, well, this is a huge deal. We got to legalize housing. We got to get rid of exclusionary zoning, allow multi-units everywhere. Well, you know, if, you know, their arguments are correct and there were tons of people who are just waiting to convert their home to a triplex, we will start to see a wave of building permits, you know, even before construction starts. And within 6 or 9 months, we'll see, you know, construction starts for those types of homes. So we can see the effects of this before the homes are even completed. You know, my instinct is we're not going to see a ton of, you know, housing starts or permits for a lot of reasons, but let's see how effective these zoning reforms are, and we can kind of discuss them at that time.
Yeah, so let's definitely track that number. Thanks, John. I think that is really useful. And I'd note also your recent report for Move Smartly talked a little bit more about municipalities' claims about their funding shortfalls, which don't even allow them to issue the number of permits because of things like, hey, all these new houses would need something as silly as wastewater removal.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
you did write about that. It's a little bit more complicated, but if we just stick to the numbers question, I do think that's really useful. And whether we need to be, as citizens, more demanding of the kind of numbers we're hearing touted as a solution. And then when we're hearing about how they're going to track it, be a little bit more aware and maybe demand a little bit better. What I'm left with from this discussion is I want to see the homepage of CMHC replaced with the big map of Canada with each province's affordability ratio right now. And maybe a further zoom in, because CMHC says urban centers, for example, in Ontario, are jurisdictions unto themselves. They take the vast majority of immigration in Canada, and their housing affordability issues are at next level. So maybe that's, if anything, I would like to see coming out of this numbers discussion, put a few more numbers on there, CMHC. Put some big bubbles about where we're at right now so that we can hold our politicians and their watchers to better accountability. And
they don't want to do that because the numbers don't look very good.
They don't, but at least they're, you know, I have a lot of sympathy, as I said, for the minds that work there. And part, to my mind, call me old school, is diagnosing the problem correctly first. And if that's the first step we have to take to get Canadians upset about how bad the numbers are, I think, you know, a little bit of bravery from somewhere is something that I would love to see, you know. But you're right. I'm not sure that politician that okays that change will get reelected. So I'm not sure that bravery will be forthcoming. But I really, really appreciate you helping us understand these numbers. And I would like to suggest a part 2 personally, which focuses a little bit more on some of the demand issues you raised. How do you accurately forecast population estimates? Because Canada is right now embarking on one of the most ambitious programs to offset what is a real population decline problem that will affect our economy. So how do we forecast for numbers that may jump up? And how does housing adjust for sharp jump ups in population numbers? Whether the changing nature of households, as you mentioned, is really properly being understood, or you've introduced something more interesting, which is suppressed household formulation. How much do we understand that? As well as that perennial pesky question about how to try and quantify how many investors there actually are and how they're impacting our market. And I understand, John, that involves a little adventure that you went on into the Middle East.
No.
To try and answer that question.
For next episode, for sure, we can chat about that.
Yes. So for now, we'd like to thank our audience. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show or feedback, you can reach John at Ask John and Move Smartly, and follow John at John Pasalis on Twitter. You can reach me at editor@movesmartly.com and follow the show at Move Smartly on Twitter. Thanks again for watching, and we will catch you next time.